I'd like to begin with your initial remarks to tell the group today a little bit about the United States Coast Guard, your mission, your vision, and what you see happening out there around the world today that you're charged with.
All right, thank you, and thank you all for being here this evening. It really is a privilege to lead the organization that we know as the United States Coast Guard. It is maybe the world's largest Coast Guard. I would tell you it's the world's best Coast Guard. Coast Guards around the world look to us, emulate us. You look no further than China Coast Guard. The racing stripes and some of their ships are modeled after the United States Coast Guard. I want to start with just some general scene setting about the Coast Guard as an organization. And you heard a little bit in the introduction. But it is worth, I think, just highlighting the duality of the fact we are at all times a military organization, a military resident in the Department of Homeland Security, but I am also a law enforcement agency at all times. And the duality of authorities and capabilities that sit within a military organization and a law enforcement organization provide a flexibility and nimbleness, a uniqueness to the United States Coast Guard that is sought by partner nations around the world. I should also add, we are a regulatory agency. And so we write regulations, we perform our flag state responsibilities with the U.S. fleet of vessels. We work in the ports and in the harbors to ensure the readiness and resiliency of the marine transportation system, as it is the key driver of economic prosperity and civility, security in the nation. And the Coast Guard is integral and involved in all that. I sometimes describe us as we're a maritime constabulary force. You could think of it in that context, where we've got law enforcement and responsibilities in the homeland, but we are also a forward deployed Coast Guard as well. The United States Coast Guard has fought in every one of the nation's battles and wars. And you could argue that we forward deployed for World War II and really never fully came back. And so, when somebody says, well, why is the Coast Guard operating in the Pacific? The Coast Guard has been operating in the Pacific for several hundred years. This isn't a change. Why is the Coast Guard in the Arctic? Again, we've been in the Arctic for 100+ years. Operating on behalf of the nation, ensuring our national sovereignty as a maritime nation. I should also highlight, well here in Los Angeles, how critical the maritime approaches are to the community, to the nation. But some Americans sort of lose track of the fact that we are a maritime nation. We're an Atlantic nation, a Pacific nation, and we're an Arctic nation. And that uniqueness in our geography contributes considerably to our national security and national prosperity. And the Coast Guard is involved in many, many roles across those realms and domains in a way that contribute to that sovereignty. We talk about, we used to talk about our 11 statutory missions. I'm not going to do that. It's actually kind of a boring way to talk about the Coast Guard. I find it more interesting to talk broadly about the organization and do it from a geographic context. So you look into the Arctic, and we are the nation's, we're operating the nation's surface asset in the Arctic. The patterns of behavior in the Arctic have changed significantly. The number of Chinese deployments in the Arctic this summer is dramatically different than what we've seen in any previous year. Russia as well. Russia is an Arctic nation as well, so they've got their own sovereign interests there, so it's not a surprise to see them there. But then joint deployments of the Chinese and Russians in the Arctic that become concerning if you view it through a sovereignty and national security, national defense lens. Go over into the Pacific and the Western Pacific as you look at China Coast Guard and behaviors there with regard particularly to the Philippines, Second Thomas Shoals, operations inconsistent with maritime governance and rule of law, and we provide a counter to that. We work with many allies and partners in the area to help them bolster and enforce their own sovereignty. This is true in Oceania. We can look south into Antarctica. And I do like to remind, we like to talk a lot about the Arctic, and we should because of our role as an Arctic nation. But Antarctica, we have equal national defense, national security interest there. And then, again, Africa, Europe, our other Arctic partner nations. The Coast Guard works across all of those portfolios, helping nations protect their own sovereignty, create capability, capacity, enforce the rule of law, and we do it in a way that, again, is consistent with maritime governance. And then there's the Homeland Mission, which most people do know us for our search and rescue work. We are some of the best in the world at that search and rescue work if you get yourself into trouble out there at sea. And I do like the caveat is if you're findable. Sometimes, sometimes that is actually a caveat. But if you're findable, we will find you. We are exceptional at that work. But then all of the work in the homeland to put aids to navigation out and mark our harbors, the work with the shipping community and the facilities to ensure that that system runs seamlessly, so that, if you're living in Kansas and you want your Nike sneakers for Christmas, the Coast Guard's got a huge role, along with the maritime partners, in making sure that happens. But I'm going to stop there and look forward to the conversation and some of the questions here.
No, it's a really good layout. And having worked overseas for 11 years, I got to see the Coast Guard in action in combination with the work that's been done in other theaters with other nations that we are counted on so greatly for. And that was pretty awe-inspiring to me. Shifting gears just a little bit, the U.S. Coast Guard is in charge of protecting the U.S. maritime system. Mm-hmm. How do you go about that responsibility? And what do you see are the biggest threats today and over the horizon?
Yeah, so we do talk about the maritime transportation system, and there are multiple elements to it. And we do have role and engagement as a regulatory agency across a number of components of the element. One of the key ways that we go about it, and the captain of the ports that sit in our ports. I happen to have been a captain of the port for New York, and one of the things that the captain of the port is able to do is they have convening authority, and through area maritime security committees and the committee structure, convene all of the interested parties in the port to come and talk about the threats, the issues, the challenges. And the power in that convening in that group, and I'm certain you've had the experiences here, is that while the Coast Guard the captain of the port actually has a veto vote if they wanted to exercise it, but that's not how we exercise that authority. It's done in a collaborative way, informed by all the entities, and you end up with really a maximized outcome to what some of the really difficult and challenging issues are. One of the challenges that I see, and it's true across the ports in the United States, we used to view the maritime realm as an unconstrained domain. It's increasingly constrained. More ships, larger ships, more people activity, more recreating, pick the things, but increasingly the pressure to access and use the waterways creates tension points in the system, and keeping pace with that change, whether it's alternative fuels or changing ship design and complexity, is a challenge that's with us now. Cyber. Cyber is a threat across different sectors in the United States. But as you look at the cyber risk in the maritime realm, and there's a lot that you've seen in the press talking about the threat to cranes. So 85 or 90% of the cranes that come into the United States to handle the containers that come off the ships into the ports are built and delivered from China. And so the concern being that there be a software backdoor or vulnerability in those cranes. We are in the process of writing a regulation to set a standard, to set standards to help harden that infrastructure and protect against threat there, and that regulation will come soon. There was an executive order signed in February that clarified the role of the Coast Guard in addressing the aftermath of a cyber impact. So if a port or a ship experienced a cyber attack and had a negative response to that, the captain of the port and their authorities, and they're charged with ensuring the safety and security of the port. And the executive order clarifies that also extends to impacts from cyber threat. But the interesting thing about the cyber threat, and as it's all been focused on the cranes, that cyber threat is here with us now, and it's not just in the ports and in the cranes. Think about any of the critical infrastructure in this country, any of the critical sectors, the power grid, oil pipelines, anything that has an internet connection, there is a potential risk and vulnerability from cyber. And it's something that not just the maritime sector, but the nation needs to be paying attention to.
And on that note, there's been a lot of work done here in LA. We celebrated 10 years in our partnership with the Department of Homeland Security in setting up the nation's first cybersecurity operations center at a port in our nation. And last year, we stopped 750 million cyber intrusion attempts at the Port of Los Angeles. And this is everything from what we see in the news, ransomware, malware, but it gets into credential harvesting and network exploitation and all kinds of stuff that could really set us on our ear. And that became so important that we, again, as a port community, developed a cyber resilience center, which brought in the private sector for the first time, some 24 partners. Co-founded with IBM in the private sector, we've stopped about 8 intrusion attempts to private sector interests that they were otherwise unaware of. Right. The messaging here is it's real, as you say, but it's also a community that has to work on this together in order for it to be effective. And I cannot understate or underscore the importance of that partnership with the United States.
No, I couldn't agree more. Right? And I mentioned the regulation, but that it requires a trust partnership between between the industry and the federal entities, and so Coast Guard, CISA. But the regulation just sort of sets a foundation for the conversation. Without that trust relationship, it really leaves the back door open.
You used to stand watch over the Pacific Command, and you've seen it evolve, and the work that we do, the partnerships that have been developed, and the importance. The cargo that comes through the Port of LA, as an example, reaches each and every one of our 435 congressional districts. It is everything to this economy when it comes to trade. How have you seen that evolution over time in the Pacific's importance, the reliance on our trade partners, their reliance on us? And where do you see that service going next?
Yeah, so I did spend time as the Pacific Area Commander. I left that role 3.5 years ago now, and and I spent 3 years in it. So first arrived out there 6.5 years ago, and when I first got there, we were talking about the Pacific, we were talking about the criticality of the Pacific, but it didn't have the same attention or sense of urgency that you certainly see and feel now, and certainly in some of the conversations in Washington, and I'm certain here, is greater understanding of the criticality of the Pacific, the criticality of our ally and partners, and the role of Coast Guards in that work and those threats that are evolving across the Pacific. We used to, one of my predecessors talked about, that we're entering an era of the Coast Guards. Well, I would argue we've always been in an era of the Coast Guards. Coast Guards provide for that maritime governance and rule of law that is necessary for maritime nations to benefit from the maritime realms. And so what you would, over the last 6.5 years in the Pacific, you see activity that erodes the rule of law and erodes sovereignty. So a specific example is in the realm of illegal fishing. So when a nation, and China is one of the worst offenders in illegal fishing, when they engage in illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and it's left unaddressed, it's theft. of natural resources, and it's an erosion of a nation's sovereignty. So one of the roles that the Coast Guard plays, and we've continued to engage and increase our capacity to do this, is to partner with nations through bilateral agreements to help assist them in enforcing their own sovereignty. So an example of this is a 270-foot medium endurance cutter that had been home ported on the east coast of the United States. A year ago, we changed the home port of the Harriet Lane to Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, if you've looked at the map, it's still a long ways from the part of the world we're talking about here, but it's closer than the East Coast. And we use that ship to partner with nations. Vanuatu. We have a bilateral agreement with Vanuatu. Harriet Lane was in Vanuatu earlier this year, embarked 4 fisheries enforcement officials from Vanuatu, and we took them out into their exclusive economic zone to board fishing vessels, Chinese and others, to enforce Vanuatu's waters. So it's a great example of a partnership where we had the ship, but it was all about Vanuatu, their sovereignty, their authority in enforcing rule of law. The demand for that kind of partnership and engagement throughout the Western Pacific and Oceania, there was a cry for it 6.5 years ago. It is deafening, the demand signal that comes towards us for ship capacity, bilateral agreements, and training teams to help nations, their coast guards, and their navies build their own expertise and capacity. And I should, one of the things that I've learned 2.5 years into this job is that, we've talked about we are the world's largest Coast Guard. Most of the world's navies are actually operating as Coast Guards. And so an interesting reflection in the Royal British Navy, the First Sea Lord, who's my peer. It's a cool name, by the way. I think it's a cooler name than Keynote, but it's a different conversation. If you take the submarines out of the Royal British Navy's portfolio and you look at the rest of what they deal with, about 75% of it is Coast Guard, maritime governance, rule of law work, countering illegal migration, countering narcotics. And so I've grown to appreciate that I actually, and there are many more navies that I'm a peer of than some of the Coast Guards who can be smaller. If I were a Navy, I would be the 3rd largest Navy in NATO, to give it some context. So, right, we tend to say, we're 55,000 people, we're not that big, a little shy of $13 billion a year. But we are the 3rd largest Navy in NATO, and the professionalism and skill that the workforce brings to this problem set is in high demand, and it continues to grow.
And interestingly, over the last 24 hours, just here in Southern California, the news coverage has been wide and far about an individual who was trying to send munitions and other technology, according to reports and open source data, over to North Korea. So this leads to the question of, we have so many codependencies, interrelationships, all on the same wavelength with the 6 branches of the military, the work that we do at federal, state, local level, like myself at the municipal here in Los Angeles. Why is the Coast Guard so important to that Pacific theater to lead in these areas of not only looking out, but the protection of these threats?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we do really well as an organization, and I talked about cyber and the engagement, here locally within the community, municipality and the community, but then you just talked about the work that we're doing to partner, engage overseas, and so the Coast Guard sort of fit. I don't like to talk about it in a home game, away game, because it sort of implies that there's sort of a void there in between. The Coast Guard operates, across that continuum, competitive space, short of conflict, in a way that is really, really powerful. And I talked about the captain of the port's convening authority. One of our great strengths as an organization, beyond the captain of the port, is that kind of convening authority, partnership, engagement. We're a small organization. I need more resources. Everybody needs more resources. But one of the great strengths that we bring to these, multifaceted, difficult problem sets is bringing teams together, creating the environment for that collaboration and discussion so that you can take a U.S. Coast Guard ship and a Vanuatu shipwrighter, or you're operating not just bilaterally with Japan, but multilaterally with Japan and Korea, the Philippines. It, as the problem set continues to sort of grow and morph, those partnerships and allyships and how we leverage them as a Coast Guard, how we leverage them as a nation broadly are going to matter. I would argue one of our competitive advantages as a nation across the problem sets coming at us is our ally and partner strength that we can rely on. There's a trust relationship there that when things start to break bad, we've got people that'll stand up and stand next to us in a way that some of the great powers that we're countering don't always have the capacity to rely on.
And if, at least from where I sit and my experience overseas, and still to this day traveling the world, it's the brand of collaboration that the U.S. Coast Guard has created over decades that allows for other nations to let you in, talk a little bit, work a little bit closer. This is not necessarily seen as a threat of the United States coming over. It's a collaborator in the U.S. Coast Guard.
Yeah, it's very, we have access and opportunity in ways that the U.S. Navy does not have. We are very good at coming to a nation where they are. Yeah. Not coming and saying, hey, I'm going to do this big grand gesture over here. We're really good at saying, how can I help? What do you need from me? Oh, you need to know how to repair your outboard engines? We can do that. Mm-hmm. I recently had a meeting with a head of a Coast Guard, and the ask was, hey, I need to get better at launching small boats and doing law enforcement boardings at sea. I can do that for you. As opposed to my offering him a whole bunch of stuff that may or may not have been useful. And so the recognition that we will help you create and increase your own capacity, your own capability to enforce your own sovereignty in a way that's respectful of your sovereignty is really the sweet spot as we look across the Pacific.
So in the role of collaborator, enabler, what's the essential need that the Coast Guard has now, even as you move into the protector that we talked about at the top of this conversation?
Yeah, so I talked about being the only military service. So we're the only military branch in the Department of Homeland Security. And this does confuse people. They're like, are you the military? But you're not over here in defense. So just a funny story though, we had one of the European nations come through. It was like a deputy prime minister. He came to meet with me at Coast Guard headquarters and then went over to the Pentagon and met with the Secretary of Defense and was raving about the Coast Guard to the point that the Secretary of Defense had to say, you do know they don't work for me. So we're the law enforcement and the work that we do in countering narcotics, preventing loss of life at sea and illegal migration attempts are well suited for us to be situated in the Department of Homeland Security. But the the budget structure in the country, it's defense and non-defense. And so the Department of Homeland Security sits on the non-defense side of the budget. And there are very strict budget caps on the non-defense side. So this creates a budget and a resourcing challenge that has been with us for a while, but is increasingly creating challenge to readiness and resilience to the force and the organization. And so thinking about how we gain the budget advocacy and the budget that we need. So approximately $13 billion a year budget right now. We're in the largest major acquisition projects, multiple projects since the end of World War II. So national security cutters, we've been fielding them for close to 15 years. Offshore patrol cutters, 2 are slated to come to the port here. The waterway commerce cutters, polar security cutter. So I talked about our critical national security and national defense needs in the Arctic. So the nation has, we have one heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, and she's currently en route McMurdo to break out the U.S. base there and do the resupply to ensure that we're able to meet our national security interests in Antarctica. The Healy, which is a medium icebreaker, is currently underway in the Arctic, but then that's it. And Polar Security Cutter, we are on budget, and we have contracted with a yard in Mississippi to begin building that ship, and we are very close to starting limited production on that ship. It has been a long process. Shipbuilding in the country, the capacity is not there, the resiliency is not there, the workforce, there's a number of aspects, and the Navy has similar challenges around this. So one is getting the budget authority and money and figuring out how to do that in a way that doesn't artificially cap the need. The Polar Security Cutter, while it would be operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, it will provide national defense and national security for our sovereignty as a nation. It's not a Coast Guard issue, it's a nation's issue and a national defense issue. And so that is the particularly difficult problem in the sort of job jar right now. I can give you good news though. About a week ago, we finalized a contract for a purchase of an existing icebreaker. So this is the IVIC, which was previously built by Shell for their attempt to begin drilling in the Arctic. It was about 8 or 10 years ago. Then when that endeavor sort of ended, the IVIC was then contracted by the Australians for 4 years, operated down in and around Antarctica, and we have just purchased that ship. And in fact, it is red with a racing stripe on it. It looks like a Coast Guard ship right now. I'm really excited. Now, we don't have a Coast Guard crew on it. We haven't, commissioned it as a Coast Guard cutter, but I am really, really excited. But that's an example of sort of a different way of creating capacity, because the need is here now. And so, that's kind of what the challenge is. Budget authority, and a recognition that this isn't just about search and rescue, and the criticality of the marine transportation system and how it contributes to all of our economic well-being, and then the role we play in creating and enforcing our own sovereignty and national defense. The DoD guys talk about they're in the lethality game and conflict. Well, short of conflict, there's an awful lot of gray space competition that's going on now, then that will go on, and that the Coast Guard is in, and you need to, virtual presence is actual absence. So you have to have ships in some of these realms.
Great. Now this was meant to be a little bit of a warm-up. So I'd like to turn it over to the audience if we have any questions. Sir? Okay, and could you introduce yourself just so everybody knows who you are?
I'm Arnie Fishman. We have a microphone that we can move around.
Yeah, let's bring the microphone. Not yet.
Now,
Test.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. Who's the first person?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Arnie Fishman. I've been a longtime member of the Pacific Council. With the new administration coming in and their view of, kind of America first, how do they look at the Coast Guard, in terms of their policy for the future? And especially with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk running around suggesting that they're going to cut a third of the government budget out. How do you guys fit into this?
Yeah, so obviously, the new administration comes into office the 20th of January. The Coast Guard, and I just think about our 234 years of history, and we've moved between departments, and the conversation around budget and resourcing, and I just outlined the acute issue around Polar Security Cutter right now. That has been a challenge with the organization all along. I have told the workforce, and as I look into the future, the value proposition that we provide to the American people with regard to security, sovereignty, and creating capacity and allies and partners. That is an apolitical proposition that will continue to withstand sort of whatever test that might come in our direction. We will continue to provide service to the American people and continue to advocate for the kinds of resourcing. And it isn't about what I want for the Coast Guard. It's about what the nation needs the Coast Guard to provide for our defense and sovereignty. And where we are right now with the Polar Security Cutter and the advocacy and we support that got that program on budget, started with the previous administration, carried through the current administration, and I would expect it to carry forward.
And this is a good policy question, and it's not politics, and that's how this great organization was built here in Los Angeles. Rough numbers, 70% of our federal budget is defense, Medicare, and Social Security. The balance 30% is everything else. So it's going to give pause to a lot to see how we want to kind of shape this dialogue and conversation to protect the interests of what we're talking about here tonight and the interests of others. I just left the Department of Agriculture coming back today and talking with the Secretary and what we're trying to do from transition standpoint, what's going to go in that binder to the next administration, what the career staff is going to be able to carry over in the work that's been done last 4 years, last 8 years across 2 administrations. So this is a very intriguing part of public policy dialogue that we're going to be having. Thank you. Ma'am.
Nice to see you again, Admiral. My name is Ashley Tabador. I'm Chief Counsel with USCIS with the department. I wanted to briefly talk about sort of recent events in the summer after the assassination attempt on the candidate Trump that brought a lot of criticism on women in law enforcement. And I wanted to thank you very much for standing with the Secretary and with the department in signing the letter in support of women in law enforcement. Can you speak a little bit about maybe some statistics about women in law enforcement in the Coast Guard, what you expect to happen in the coming years in terms of the approach, perspective on women in law enforcement, and what can we do to recruit? Because I can tell you that I definitely have found it makes a difference who's at the table, what background, and having women in law enforcement and national security is a critical part of ensuring our security. So if you can speak to that, I would really appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. When I came in 2.5 years ago, one of my 3 priorities was workforce and talent management transformation. And teams that reflect the diversity of the country, and I use that term as broadly as you can. This isn't a gender or a race conversation. Teams that have diverse perspectives and views and skills, when brought together with the right tools and training, they outperform teams that are homogenous. The value proposition for the organization as a military service is that I'm hiring talent, and I want the very best talent that I can hire. But I also need to make sure that there aren't workforce policies in place that create an artificial barrier. So the work that we've done, and it did start with, all right, how do we increase retention around the number of women that we have serving, and policies around maternity leave and family leave. And the reality is, when you make it easier for women to join and stay and serve, you make it easier for everyone. Because you had artificial barriers in there that increasingly the generation that we're recruiting from just no longer accept as a condition of employment. So it has been an interesting sort of move forward, because we were suffering recruiting wise. When 2.5 years ago, we were in the same place the other services were. We had not met our recruiting numbers. It wasn't even that you had any sort of target. We just weren't getting the people, the capital and talent that we needed. And so changing some of these policies and assumptions around service. So an example would be, we're an up or an out organization. We've run the organization that way since the end of World War II. You enter at the bottom as an 18-year-old. This is true on the officer side and the enlisted side. And then you get onto a conveyor belt and you proceed forward at a speed. Well, there's no opportunity to step off and hold. It's very difficult to sort of step out, step back in again. All of those are examples of barriers that we've been working to break down. The Coast Guard Academy is a really good news story for us as an organization. This goes back about 10 years. The Coast Guard Academy is nearly 40% women. And so we're drawing young women into the field and into the talent, and then the challenge is to retain them. The overall number in the organization, though, with regard to particularly the number of women serving, has been frustratingly unmoving. But whenever I get pressed on the question, well, do you have targets or quotas? No, I'm hiring talent. I want the absolute best talent that we can bring into the service. And I will share with the group, having been through Cape May recently, our enlisted accession point, the young people. I know we like to malign the younger generation sometimes. They are impressive, and they have a sense of purpose and dedication and passion to the work that really leaves me optimistic for not just the future of the organization, but for the future of the nation. And again, ensuring that anyone who seeks the opportunity to serve and who meets the standards of service, that you don't have an artificial barrier in place for them, for their ability to serve and bring their best selves to work every day.
Two rows back in the middle, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lisa Som Manning from RAND, and we've done a lot of studies for the Coast Guard and really enjoyed working and research in that regard. One of the pieces that really is interesting to me is the security cooperation piece and working with allies and partners and thinking about how does the Coast Guard fit into the broader Indo-PACOM kind of operational plans, and I've seen a lot of stuff, and I haven't seen a lot of Coast Guard in that. So how do you integrate and leverage in the work that you're doing with allies and partners? How does that integrate into what the rest of the military is doing within the...
Okay, great question, and I should have touched on it, and I didn't. So we have either Coast Guard liaison officers or Coast Guard assets deployed in support of just about every one of the combatant commanders. We have 6 fast response cutters in Bahrain, working the problem set there alongside the Navy and CENTCOM, Indo-PACOM, liaison officer ships. Every one of those combatant commands' operational plans and planning concepts have Coast Guard resources written into them. We participate in the global force management process at the Pentagon, and when they have a need, they work through the request for forces a process. It comes to us, and we negotiate ships. Fully integrated with our DoD services through not just their planning process, but their actual operating process. So when a ship, a national security cutter, goes over into the Western Pacific and does a Taiwan Straits transit, it's done under the operational control of PAC Fleet and the Indo-PACOM team, all fully integrated. And so there's a lot of power there. And 20 years ago, we did not have that tight or coherent, or the muscle memory that we have now, and the trust relationship that we have between the services. The other place where then the Coast Guard fits in a unique role, and I'll use Russia as an example, and then some of the Coast Guard forums that we participate in. So the team in D-17 in Alaska, well, it may not be daily conversation with the Russian border guard. It's weekly conversations with regard to our shared interest in the maritime boundary line. So there's a door conversation around operational maritime governance and reality along that shared boundary line that the Coast Guard has as interlocutor with Russia. We participated in a number of Coast Guard forums, North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum, Arctic Coast Guard forums, and this is where then the strength of bringing allies and partners together regularly to talk through, through a Coast Guard lens on some of the maritime governance challenges and create that synergy and alignment. Again, that is skill and insight that we bring as we cross over to the DoD side with our DoD partners. And another just sort of final example of how sort of well integrated this is. So while I am not a member of the Joint Staff by law, by practice I am. I'm in the Pentagon every Friday with the other service chiefs and the chairman having these conversations. And so sometimes people are like, well, you're over here in DHS. The reality is the only thing that divides the Coast Guard from the Pentagon team is like the length of 295 that it takes to get from my headquarters to their headquarters, but we are fully integrated, and both in the processes and in the day-to-day operation and alignment. Thanks, that was a great question. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a couple on this side now. Straight to the back, and then we'll work our way back around.
Hello. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Mr. Seroka. I'm Aaron Nordauer. I'm a deputy to LA County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath. Represents a lot of the coastline here in LA County. I've learned a little bit in talking to the Navy about their plans that are fairly proactive around adaptation to climate change. I'm less familiar with what the Coast Guard's doing. If you could share a couple of the specific things that you've been doing, and also if resources weren't an obstacle, what would you like to do?
Well, I'd like more money, so if you guys can help with that, that'd be great. So, as a maritime service, we do our missions with things that float, and which puts us right into the challenge around around climate change and some of the impacts. And we have a climate strategy, and one of the things that we have done particularly in the areas that are prone to hurricane damage, as the hurricane supplementals and money comes towards the organization to rebuild, we've done that in ways that have been very sort of climate informed, so that you rebuild a much more kind of hardened infrastructure. Things like your ground floor really becomes kind of a wash away. You use it and you have office spaces down there, but all of your critical communications and nodes of supply are elevated so that if you have storm surge come through, it minimizes impact to the building. So in a number of cases, hurricanes 5, 6, 7 years ago, buildings rebuilt, and they are experiencing much fewer impacts than what would have been previously. The challenge is not every part of the country is hurricane prone, and so with sea level rise in particular, we've got areas that are exposed, and it is going to come with a significant infrastructure bill and need, and continuing to factor that in as we make those longer term home porting investments are part of the challenge in front of us. And this is where the budget and resource constraint becomes most acute, and it is most acute in infrastructure, piers, buildings. It's acute in the maintenance account and in the parts account. And so that kind of combination is a particular challenge right now as we move the organization forward.
Good question.
Yeah.
Hi. I jumped in. I'm Christina Pascucci, a new member. Thank you both so much. I think I've interviewed you, Gene, at some point in my capacity as TV broadcaster, so great to see you. Thank you for all this wisdom. I have 3 questions. Can I fire them off?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So if I forget the third one, I'll come back to it.
Okay, great. Well, I'll do it one at a time. So you mentioned ships that need to be in these geographical regions like the Arctic, the Antarctic. Why is that presence so important?
Well, as I said, virtual presence is actual absence. So you can do a lot with technology to detect dark targets, illegal patterns of fishing, illegal ship-to-ship transfers. But if you don't have a ship to sort of create in-game, to do a boarding, enforce the laws. It's interesting, but you've not actually created impact or effect. Particularly in the Arctic, increasingly, and this is where the climate patterns have definitely changed. The Arctic is becoming increasingly ice-free. I don't know when it will become completely ice-free. The reality is more water, less ice, more human activity. And if you're on a cruise ship and you have a disaster of some kind or there's an accident, you need a physical ship or a helicopter to come and save and create an effect. So moving those precious assets around become part of the challenge. But when you look at the rate of shipbuilding of both the Chinese and the Russians, we're behind. And the shipbuilding capacity and industrial base in the country is behind with regard to what we need to do.
The two other questions are, one, I don't want to speak for others in the room, but I'm feeling kind of anxious about the state of the world right now. And how do you feel in terms of the threat level today compared to what you've seen in your decades of service? And secondly, you mentioned that in response to the cyber threats, there's some legislation that's ongoing right now. Everyday technological warfare is advancing exponentially. Legislation is slow as heck when it comes to government, as you know. So how do you meet that need and demand to respond to these threats, which are extremely time sensitive when you're dealing with government?
Yeah, and so, it is a regulation, and we've been through, and if any of you follow the regulatory process, you know how glacial it can feel. This particular regulation's actually moved quite quickly, and it's a demonstration of the increasing speed that the risk is coming at us. With regard to just sort of global, I'm just going to put it in the terms of global instability, and I've worn this uniform for over 40 years. The pace that you see the change happening in the players, and then alignment of nations who've previously been like sworn enemies, all of that is really, really troubling, and I think that sort of instability and the pace that is coming at us is going to continue to increase. And so what it means for us as a nation is we need to be challenging some of our glacial processes, whether it's around regulations or how we buy and acquire things as a nation. The federal acquisition rules they're there for a reason. You can go back and trace some of the sort of failed projects that laws were put in place to shore up against, but it creates a very rigid, slow process that I would argue will not serve us with the kind of speed that we may need as you look into the future. Just a couple of weeks ago, the nation signed what's called ICE Pact, Canada, Finland, U.S., 4 lines of effort to open a door to a collaborative conversation around icebreakers. Finnish have got some great cutting-edge technology. And how do you bring some of your allies into a broader conversation around exactly this? And the United States is not alone in this pressure point. The Canadians, the Finns, the Norwegians, everyone is sort of struggling with the speed of shipbuilding and the speed to need to counter the pace that the change is coming at us.
Thanks, Christina. I think we have time for one last question. Sir?
Yes, thank you so much. And this is actually going to be as much, I guess, a compliment as a question, because I think you kind of answered it a moment ago. But I still wanted to share it for both for you and all the other members of the Coast Guard in attendance. I was very fortunate to participate in a Pentagon program where I spent 3 days out on the water with the Coast Guard out of Miami. And it was one of the most incredible things. I mean, you can list all the things the Coast Guard accomplishes, but when you see it firsthand, and I got to spend a lot of time on the boat with all of these young people you're talking about, and I would watch them in the course of literally like a shift. They would rescue somebody from a ship that sank that was out there like in the water, then they would have to go and follow a speedboat that was bringing in drugs and stop that boat. then they would, at the end of the thing, just to round it out, would have to like save a distraught group of migrants who had been caught out in a boat somewhere and had were essentially like starving, and they would have to take care of these people on the ship. And when you think about how different those tasks are, and these people were just so young and amazing. And the thing that I guess if I have a question at all about it is like how, one thing I noticed that besides being amazed with the professionalism was that there was just such an upbeat kind of morale, the morale amongst these young people, and not even don't mean just young people, because there were everybody on the crew. There was just a morale that I thought was really unique, and I thought it was unique even to the other services in the military. And I'm just curious how you, if that's something that is an effort, or if that just kind of comes naturally because that's the kind of people you recruit. But anyway, I just wanted to offer that compliment to all of you and your staff. They're incredible.
It's our special sauce that you're talking about right there. Right? It's the way we build and empower our leaders, both on the enlisted side and the officer side, is unlike any of the other services. And we give very young people a lot of responsibility, and we give it to them early. And we have a couple operating principles. One's unity of effort, right? Creating that kind of unity around what you want to accomplish. But one of them is on-scene initiative, which means the coxswain of that boat's in charge. He's not taking directions from a chief back at the unit. He's not taking directions from somebody at the sector. So it provides a sense of ownership, pride, belonging, that you see. And it's not, people will reflect similar sentiments, and they'll be like, oh, you handpicked this person, this is the best person. So no, that's the person that just happened to be on duty today. I mean, and that's the depth of the talent pool, and it is, I am incredibly optimistic for the service, and it is those young people, and then the way we build and nurture those leaders and talents, and create effect on the water, and in ways that are always mindful of ours and others' humanity. It really is the special sauce for the service, and I do think we're unique in a number of regards, and this is one of them. So thank you.
Great point. And I'm also reminded about the breadth and depth of what the United States Coast Guard is doing here in Los Angeles. Michelle Schwartz is here today from LA 28. We've got the 34th Olympiad being hosted in Los Angeles, and there will be water sports and sailing off the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. So that'll be another layer of work that we're going to be doing, public sector, private, municipality, and trying to make sure that we have great protections and that our visitors can enjoy those games to the fullest while we make sure trade and commerce continues to move in a safe way. So it's going to be tremendous. With that, Admiral, this has been tremendous. Would you like to make some closing comments to the audience?
So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions. I hope you've picked up at least something that you didn't know about the Coast Guard. We are absolutely critical to the nation's economic prosperity, our security, our defense. We are unique. There is no other Coast Guard like us in the world. Every now and then somebody will say, well, if we can't get you the budget, we'll just take one of those things away from you that you would do. And to the point just made, it doesn't work like that. We crew a ship and you send it out, and they're doing counter-narcotics enforcement, illegal fisheries, pulling migrants out of the water, countering a great nation power. You pick it, but it's the same crew and team. And so disaggregating the organization is not the solution. And so, hopefully as you reflect on us, creating the budget appropriation support really is, that is job one for me in Washington. But the nation needs the Coast Guard, and I would argue the nation needs more Coast Guard than what we're budgeted for right now. And so, thank you, and it's been just a privilege to be here today.